Hi, and welcome to the 6th episode of Our Connected Future. I'm your host, Max Peacock, and in this episode, I'm joined by Stephen Fai. Steve is former director of the Israeli School of Architecture at Carleton University, and he's also the current director of Carleton's Immersive Media Studio, otherwise known as CIMS. In our conversation, Steve and I discussed the mission behind CIMS and the technologies they use to create immersive digital representations. Steve also shares some critical reflections about the unpredictability of innovation and the need for deep thinking and optimism as we seek to build technological solutions to global challenges. If this all sounds interesting to you, make sure to stay tuned for this episode. This podcast series is a part of a larger overarching project called the BMPD Storytellers project, which includes a growing variety of works from other students in the program. To check out the works of other BMPD storytellers, you can visit our website and socials, which are linked down below. This is your host, Max Peacock, and you're listening to episode 6 of Our Connected Future featuring Stephen Fai. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, enjoy. All right. Okay, Steve, thanks so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Max. Nice to be here.
Awesome. I'm hoping we can start with a brief history of your career. You're the director of Carleton's Immersive Media Studio, also known as CIMS, and you're also one of the former directors of Carleton's School of Architecture. Could you tell me a bit about how you first discovered your passion for architecture and how this passion has led you to the work that you're doing today with these organizations?
Well, a long time ago, I read a book called Toward a New Architecture. The real title is Toward an Architecture, I later learned. But I read that book, and I was actually, I had a career. I was living in Alberta. I was originally from Saskatchewan, born in Saskatchewan. But I think I was about 24 years old, something like that. And I was working for the city of Medicine Hat in the property department. And I was doing a lot of property management. It was a good job. And then I happened to read this book, just really by chance. And the book was by one of the most infamous architects of the 20th century, whose name is Corbusier. And I read this book, and even though I had worked with architects on a daily basis in my job, this book painted such an amazing picture of what architecture could be, that I was completely seduced. And I decided then that I had to be an architect. So I did some research, again, spoke to some of the architects I knew. They recommended Carleton as the place to go. This was 1984. And I did some research and discovered that in order to get into architecture school, you had to know how to draw. And it's not something I'd ever practiced. So I taught myself how to draw and paint. And over the year, I created a portfolio and submitted it. And miraculously, I was admitted to the school. So I did, at the time, it was a 5-year program. For a professional degree in architecture. So I went through that education. It was a great education, and graduated with my professional degree in architecture in 1990. And at the time, there was a huge recession happening, and there was no work for architects. And out of my class of, I think there were about 40 of us that graduated, I was one of the few who actually got a job with an architect. And I worked with her, Cecilia Humphreys, for a couple of years, and then work dried up. So I was faced with some student debt, and no career prospects. So I decided that I would go back to university, and I started a whole other line of education in religious studies. At the University of Ottawa, I'd met some people there, Marie-Françoise Guidon primarily, and religion was always something I was interested in, not because I practice any faith, but just as a phenomenon. I thought it was always fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So I did an undergraduate, master's, and PhD in religious studies, and that got me more interested in academic pursuits. Because even though I was in religious studies, I was looking at things about architecture, ideas about architecture. And at the same time, I was a contract instructor at the School of Architecture at Carleton. So I was still involved there. But as I say, that got me interested in becoming an academic. Um, and I joined the school full time in 1998. Again, part time as a contract instructor, but then I was hired full time in 1998. And then within a couple of years, just because of the situation at the school, I became an acting director and then director very early in my career, which left a very um, uh, how can I say, a bad taste in my mouth for for that kind of administration. It's a very difficult job, and I admire anyone who takes on those roles in the university. I appreciate their contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then through that, I was involved in the hiring of the next director, who was Marco Friscari, who was someone who I was very familiar with his work. I had met him a couple of times. Um, Someone who I still admire greatly, and his work. So he agreed to become the next director of the school. And through that process, he asked me in 2007 to become the director of the Carleton Immersive Media Studio. And to be completely honest, I had absolutely no interest in becoming the next director of the Carleton Immersive Media Studio. And my former colleague, Michael Gemtrude, who founded the CIMS, founded the lab, he had left to become the director of McGill. And I had supported him in my directorship in order to build CIMS, but I wasn't really an active researcher. So I said to Marco, I through my uh, PhD research, which I wanted to continue as most people do. I wanted to write a book. I said, I'm interested in bodies and churches. That was the link in my dissertation. And he said, well, that's fine. Go to CIMS and do research on bodies and churches. So I took that as a challenge. And what some of our very early research at CIMS was looking at biomedical representation, uh, linked to bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So actually working with Katie Graham,
Mm-hmm.
her and I are um, have been at CIMS exactly the same amount of time, because she was an undergraduate when she started working with me on these biomedical representations. That was my first project at CIMS as well. So she's a kind of co-founder in the new CIMS, if you will.
Yeah.
And the other project that we undertook almost immediately was documenting some religious buildings in Saskatchewan. And why Saskatchewan? It's really because of the kind of diversity in the immigration of Saskatchewan. So we were trying to look at ethnically diverse buildings within a very close geographical area, and to determine how much culture played a role in the construction of those buildings, and how much expediency played a role in the construction of those buildings.
Hmm.
So those are my first two CIMS projects, and it was difficult for the first few years because there wasn't a lot of funding available. But then gradually we through this work, I realized that an emerging trend in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry was something called building information modeling. And in building information modeling, you have the geometric representation of a building or of a neighborhood, of a city. But then linked to that, you also have a database or databases. So each element in each geometric element within the model, within the architectural model, can have its own parameters and its own information attached to it. So, for example, a window, you can have the geometric representation of the window, but then in the database you can have what type of glass it is, when it was installed, who installed it, who the manufacturer is, when it should be replaced, all that kind of information.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized that while that was beginning to take hold in the industry, in the area of heritage, heritage conservation, no one was talking about that idea. So I thought that this seemed like something that people in heritage conservation should be looking at. So I really focused all of the lab's energy and resources on that subject, and it turned out that it was a good decision. So the first conference I went to present the work of CIMS, it was on these churches in Saskatchewan. This is about 2010, 2009, 2010. There was myself and one other person at the conference who were presenting on this idea of building information modeling for heritage conservation. It was Maurice Murphy from Dublin, from the Technical University. And we were the only two who were talking about this subject. In 2017, CIMS, with my colleague Mario Santana, Laurie Smith, we hosted a conference at Carleton of the international group called SIPA that looks at heritage documentation. There were probably 20 sessions on building information modeling and heritage. I mean, it's become a huge thing in the last 15 years. So through this idea of building information modeling for heritage conservation, we got involved with the rehabilitation of the West Block, Parliament Hill. That led us to being involved in the Center Block of Parliament Hill. And through those projects, that's where we developed a truly international reputation as a leader in that area. And through those projects, we started to explore other ways to use this information, like the models, the metric data that we were gathering in order to build the models. So through that, we developed 4 lines of research: reality capture, or so using laser scanning, photogrammetry to take the physical world and bring it into the digital world. Building information modeling, as well as other types of modeling, but primarily building information modeling. Something we call digitally assisted fabrication. So we acquired 2 robotic arms and started working with more traditional craftspeople and introducing digital technology into their traditional workflows. So, for example, a sculptor could make a maquette of something. Mm-hmm. We could capture it. Using the robots, we could roughly mill it out in stone, say, or any material, wood, and then the sculptor could finish it by hand. And then the 4th area of research, or stream of research that we developed, was digitally assisted storytelling. So using AR, VR, web-based technologies in order to engage the public, again, not exclusively, but primarily in questions of heritage and heritage conservation. So that in a nutshell is my career and the history of CIMS, the relationship between those two.
I think that's so interesting. I like the way you broke the research down into those 4 streams of research done at CIMS. For people that are unfamiliar with the organization, what is the overarching mission behind CIMS that drives those streams of research?
Well, as I say, my my predecessor, Michael Gemtrude, he was looking at using very high level or very sophisticated visualization technologies um, and introducing those into architecture. So one project, for example, was looking at a software called Maya, which is a software that is used in a lot of a lot of motion pictures, a lot of movies, and that software was actually originally developed by a Canadian company. And one of the projects that Michael was involved in was using Maya, but in an architectural context. So the idea was to develop a kind of a front end, an architectural front end, with Maya as the rendering engine in the background, which would have been quite an amazing development actually. But then what happened is Autodesk bought Maya, and Autodesk makes architectural software, so that project was completely shelved. So when I came to CIMS, my idea was to again refocus on this idea of building information modeling, again primarily for heritage conservation. But what it has grown into, and as I say, we have worked primarily in heritage, in the world of heritage, but not exclusively. And more recently, what we've been doing is focusing on bringing new and emerging digital technologies to the architecture, engineering, construction industry more generally. So one of the things I'm most proud of at CIMS is the multidisciplinary nature of the research group. We have architects, engineers, and that's systems engineers, civil and environmental engineers. We have computer scientists. We have human-computer interaction people. We have information technology people, both the hardware and the animation side. We have historians who are involved with this. So it's all of these, again, primarily students working together in this multidisciplinary environment. And when you get that kind of mix happening and you get all these brilliant young people together, you come up with solutions that no one else could have ever imagined. So what we've been and we've been moving more recently is to take that kind of energy and that kind of potential and offer it to the what's called the AECO, architecture, engineering, construction, owner operator industry. So if you think of the built environment, to take that kind of energy and potential and bring it to people who are involved in the built environment. So right now, I would say that is our mission, is to help the industry to become more conscious of what its impact is on the environment. So to help it build more, and I hesitate to use the word efficient because that makes it sound like we just want them to be able to make more money. I have no problem with people making, but more urgently, I think, is that people build more responsibly. So with digital technologies, what you can do is you can simulate the construction of something, and you can plan it out in advance, and hopefully, again, make places that are people can enjoy, but also that are less harmful to the environment. So I would say we are transitioning from a shop that really is focused on heritage to a shop that is really focused on enhancing the built environment through digital
That's
technology.
Sounds like a really important mission. I'm curious to know more about how the role of technology has changed in your research over the years. Like, were there any notable points in your career where there is a new technological innovation that allowed you to kind of break new grounds in your research? Are there any pivotal moments that you felt in your career where innovation was allowing you to do new things?
I certainly think building information modeling was a pivotal a pivotal point. I quite honestly, I was always skeptical of digital technologies, particularly CAD in architecture. Um, it just made everything seem very like the whole production of architectural design. It made it feel very generic. Every project
Mm.
looked the same, and it honestly it just never made sense to me.
Mhm.
Where if you've ever seen a CAD screen, there's red lines and green lines and yellow lines, and each color represents a different thickness of line, because in architectural drafting, the thickness of a line is significant. You know,
Mm.
a thick line means it's cut. A thinner line means it's either below or above. So CAD never made sense to me, but building information modeling, because you are working with ideas of this is a window, this is a door, this is a column, this is a wall. That made sense. It's like when you build a physical model, that kind of logic. And then again, the relationship of those objects to the database also just made so much sense, because you could put not only information about um, you know technical specifications in that database, but you could also put historical information in the database. So for a heritage building, it could be this was built by Ukrainian settlers, and the technique of log construction that they used comes from this region of Ukraine. So that was a pivotal moment for me, because it suggested that architectural representation could also tell stories to a more general public, which is again the digitally assisted storytelling as a stream that sort of took off from that idea.
And would you say that that stream of digitally assisted storytelling has that brought CIMS' work more into the public sphere? Because that allows people to actually, using virtual reality, enter the environments that you guys have created. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, um, and we worked in a number of different modes as well, and media. So we've done web-based. So, for instance, for the Senate of Canada, we've done um, three iterations of a tour of the Senate and the heritage assets that the Senate manages. And in those experiences, it's like they're photospheres. So you move. It's a bit like Google Earth, but
Mm-hmm.
much more detail. And you're able to move from photosphere to photosphere, and then to identify specific elements within that sphere, and then get more information on those elements. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. But then we've also done um, VR experiences that are are passive. So where you stand in the space and look around, and through various cues you are told a story, but you're able to move your head around. But right now we're actually building an experience, and it's funded by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, and we're partnering with the National Arts Center, and we're building an experience that tells the history of the National Arts Center. And this is an active VR experience where there are three narratives. Um, the A narrative about the origin of the NAC. How did it come to be? And how did it come to be built? And then there's a narrative about the kind of middle years and the transformations that happened at the NAC, and it's quite a turbulent history actually. And then finally, the, the kind of rejuvenation of the National Arts Center, and the recent uh, rehabilitation and addition to the building. And within those narratives, there are three stories from three different characters. Uh, so there's one of the characters is an architect, one of the characters is someone who works at the NEC, one of the characters is a musician. So you get a number of different perspectives on the building within those three historical periods, if you will. So it's three narratives, nine stories, and the stories are linked to the archive that the National Arts Center has. Um, and so what you get to see in the VR experience are artifacts that are held by the NAC but have never been on public display because they
Mm.
just don't have the capacity to. So, for example, there are costumes from productions in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. There are the works of art that are um, uh, in the NAC that are part of the part of the fabric of the NAC. There are scripts, there are playbills, um, Glenn Gould's piano. Um, all of these things have been meticulously modeled by the CIMS crew, and you can view them within the experience, whereas you wouldn't be able to otherwise. So again, that storytelling, it's kind of the whole gamut of media.
That's so cool. What's the process like of embarking on a project like that from start to finish? Like I'm sure it's not a short one. And what are the main technological limitations in the process that exists right now?
Well, this project with the National Arts Center, I think, was about 6 or 7 years in the making, um, and it took three separate funding applications. If anyone out there has ever written a funding application, they know that 1 in 3 is not bad odds actually to get. Um, so that was, I think, one of the bigger hurdles. The NAC was always on board to develop this project. Um, when we first started talking about this, there wasn't actually the technological bandwidth to do what we're doing right now. And by that I mean game engines did not have the capacity to process the kind of fidelity that we're able to model right now. And on top of that, there wasn't the capacity to put something like this online so that anyone 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 who has high speed internet can actually access, and that's not everyone in the country, unfortunately, can access this experience. So we're using the Unreal Game Engine right now, and um, it is advanced to the point where the the scene that you're able to present is almost limitless in how detailed it could be, um, and through something called pixel streaming, we're able to actually deliver it through a browser, deliver the experience through a browser. So I mean, and these are like brand new uh, changes that are happening to the technology. So
And how much better do you think the technology will really get? Like maybe better as an oversimplification of how it'll change the work process, but will it just be higher fidelity models and basically getting more data onto a browser? Like what does innovation look like technologically in that field of research?
well, I always hesitate to make predictions because I guess in my experience, it's it's never these developments are never linear. Technology is not linear. Um, so what we project um, is typically again in that trajectory. I did this, I did this, I did this. So next I'll probably do this. But what tends to happen is, I do this, and then it goes like this.
Hmm.
And the example I like to use is a cell phone. Uh, I I I got my first cell phone in um, 1995, something like that. And when I got it, I thought it was a miraculous thing, because my brother had a satellite telephone, you know, which is this huge, came in like a suitcase, cost enormous amount of money to buy and to use. I
Hmm.
thought that was amazing, a wireless telephone. Who would imagine? And then the cell phone came, and it was like, this is incredible. If you get stranded on the road, you can call somebody. But the idea that your cell phone would be your camera, your you would be sending messages to someone, that you could watch movies or the news on your phone, that, like, I would have called someone crazy if they would have, suggested that. Like,
Yeah.
why would you do that on your phone? So I that's kind of my touchstone for, what is the future of technology? No idea, but it's pretty exciting.
I think that's a totally fair answer. I think it's super exciting, and I think it's something we also need to think critically about because I think we can often
Yep.
innovate recklessly in many different ways. And maybe this is a good segue into another organization that you're involved in, which is the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats, which is a nonprofit organization committed to bringing positive change in communities and promote sustainable practices. So I'm curious to know what is the role or what is the connection between the work that you've done in architecture at Carleton and then your involvement with mindful habitats, and how do we think about technology in relation to building sustainable communities?
Well, my connection with Mindful Habitats is through one of the founding members, Pallavi Soranjali. And I worked with Pallavi on her PhD dissertation. I was one of her supervisors. Um, and I've, I've been very supportive of her work. Um, we I participated in the first series of conversations that they hosted last year, about a year ago now, I think, um, where we engaged in a conversation about, the use of digital technologies um, in the built environment. And I've also been invited to contribute a piece to an upcoming publication that Mindful Habitats is doing, that is actually tied to the work that we did a decade ago in Saskatchewan, on one of the small religious buildings that we looked at out there. Um, as I said earlier, I don't use the word efficiency when I talk about technology, because it does have connotations of, just more consumption, and uh, and I do think that, and through our work, I think we've been able to contribute, I hope so, to just allowing people not to see technology as something that sort of pushes you forward faster, but actually allows you the opportunity to just step back for a moment and to think something through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's the real value of, of the technology, certainly that we're using, is it gives you a space to look at things in a different way and reconsider how you're going to move forward, how you're going to act. So I see it as a kind of a thinking space. We're able to create that pause for a moment, which I think is a very, I wouldn't say unique, but unconventional approach to technology.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And would you argue that we need that thinking space more than ever? Does right now feel like a crucial time to be nurturing that kind of thinking around the use of technology and its innovation?
Absolutely. Um, there was just there was not enough time for thinking, and not enough consideration on how valuable it is to just stop and just consider what is happening. Um, and as we're talking today, and I'm not going to politicize this conversation, but as we're talking today, there's a group of people occupying the center of Ottawa. Um, and there appears to have been no thought into what next, just
Hmm.
what next. Whether you agree with their demands or not, we need to consider what our next steps are. And I think everything from that to the climate crisis. And my concern there is that there is a lot of rhetoric um, that's happening, and a lot of we must do this, we must do that, but there is no comprehensive plan that has been put forward. That's troubling, very, very troubling.
When it comes to addressing these issues that you've just mentioned, what do you think the role of community, like local community, is in addressing these? Because that seems to be a focus of mindful habitats.
Yeah, absolutely essential. And I think, I mean, one of our large projects that we're working on right now is called Imagining Canada's Digital Twin.
Oh,
And in the United Kingdom, there's a digital build Britain is the name of the project that's been happening. And we looked at that project and thought, you know, that that's interesting. How do you take all of the digital resources that are being developed? So, I mean, each city, for example, um, each major metropolitan area, I should say, is developing a digital model or models of their assets, and then on top of that are being mapped infrastructure, so sewer, water, all of that stuff. So each metropolitan area has or is developing that, but there doesn't seem to be any communication between those entities. And so that's in the UK. You can sort of imagine it, because you can cross from the north to the south of the UK in a day. Um, but in Canada, between major metropolitan areas, there's a lot of space, but it's not empty. People live there, and infrastructure is what's connecting those major nodes, and that infrastructure passes through those spaces between. And Statistics Canada identifies the rural as essentially whatever is non-urban.
mm,
So I think what's happening, or what has happened, is that there's become a polarization between major urban areas and everything else. And that I think that the recent events have really highlighted that. And I mean, it's overly optimistic, but I'm hoping that somehow in our conception of the digital twin, and we are very much at the stage of imagining Canada's digital twin, that somehow we can address that distance between the urban and the rural. And of course, the rural is so, to say it like that makes it sound like some sort of homogenous, um, mass, or space, but it's not. I mean, it's made up of farms, towns, villages, indigenous communities. Um, it's a very heterogeneous thing that is treated like a very homogeneous thing. So somehow that diversity that exists outside of rural, and of course, urban areas are not homogeneous either. Um, but somehow, if we can manage to communicate the diversity of that of the rural, but also the diversity of urban areas, and somehow let people or help people to appreciate the differences that exist amongst us, rather than to polarize into factions. Again, that's truly overly optimistic that somehow we would be able to do that. But in some ways, that was the goal of the internet in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, all of human knowledge could be made available for everyone. And although it's led to, again, arguably, it's led to social media, which has led to increased polarization, I still find inspiration in that. And I still find the internet a miraculous thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can go online and I can type in the name of a 13th century manuscript and get a high fidelity version of it that I can view for free. If somehow we can remember the kind of optimism that was in that vision of the internet, I think we could resolve some of this tension and anxiety that the world is experiencing right now.
I'm optimistic about that too, and I'm optimistic that we'll find that collective optimism in approaching these issues. A question that I like to end these episodes with, Steve, is if there's any food for thought or advice that you want to leave student listeners with, any food for thought to consider as they finish their degrees.
Yeah, well, I guess two things that we've kind of touched on. One is either remain or become optimistic, and secondly, don't give up on thinking.
Amazing. Okay, I think that's great advice. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to chat.
Same, Max. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for tuning in to the 6th episode of Our Connected Future. For updates on this podcast and the other BMPD storytelling projects, please visit our website and social links down below. This is your host, Max Peacock, signing off, and you'll hear from me again in the next episode. Cheers.